We are all part of the system. This is Making Sense with Robbie. Let's get started. Conspiracies often come out of this observation that different groups or parties appear to be working together towards a similar objective. While those people seem to be working together, that's often the way that it appears, and it almost is working that way, right? Because while you're making those observations, those are true observations. But the risk or the danger of the conspiracy theory is that it's assumed that those groups are working together, or that they're in tandem, or that there's some plan, or that there's someone guiding the way. And often what is actually happening is that there's this series, or there's different types of motivations for different parties involved. There's different systems interacting together, and these systems sort of working towards their own objectives, but those objectives might be shared, or those objectives might influence other people's objectives. I'm not saying that there aren't any conspiracies. I'm just saying that oftentimes it might be easier to create a narrative to describe something that uses a whole bunch of interconnected sort of groups and has their actions going towards a certain outcome. And while that description is an accurate description of what is happening, or it could be an accurate description of what's happening, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a motivation behind those actions, or that there is control to those actions. And I for myself, I feel like this has happened a lot, is when I describe sort of my observations about what I think is happening to some friends, they get this impression that I'm suggesting a conspiracy, but it's often not really a conspiracy. It's just a whole bunch of different interconnected systems working together, driving towards a goal that really no one has much control over, but that's going to happen anyways, regardless of what anyone does. A system is a group of interacting or interrelated elements that act according to a set of rules to form a uniform whole. A system surrounded and influenced by its environment is described by its boundaries, structures, and purpose, and expressed in its functioning. So that's sort of a definition of what a system is, and I think it's good to just put that out there so that we have some sort of frame of reference as we move forward. Often things seem like they're coordinated, or they're working together, or there's a conspiracy, there's a group motivation. But like I said, it's a whole bunch of interlocking systems or interrelated systems working together. And all of those systems might have their own motivations and different aspects, but those motivations all work together. And those motivations for one system influence the behaviors of another system. And so they appear to be coordinated, and they are coordinated in a sense, but it's more they're determined, or they're working together, or they're interrelated. And there doesn't have to be anyone in control. There doesn't have to be anyone pushing things in one way. It's just they go the way that they're going, and all the parties who are involved go along for the ride. A lot of times we exist in systems that are determined by our environment, and while we have a certain level of ability to make choice, a lot of choices are made for us. You could say well, you have a free choice to not go to work or whatever, and to a certain extent that's true, but continue to live a relatively normal life, you don't have a choice about stopping that. You have to keep on doing that. So the idea here is that you could say that that's a conspiracy, or there's some kind of control there, and there is control, but it's more like a system that's controlling things, as opposed to a person controlling things. And so I want to talk about a little bit of some systems. A big one that we might hear about often is the decline of America and the rise of China. And you could say, well, there's this hidden agenda to destroy America and raise China. But if you step back and look at the systems themselves, you have America, which is, let's say, it's been the powerhouse of the world since World War II. So we're approaching 80 years, and maybe that's just how long an empire lasts for, and that's why it's ending, and that's why it appears that there's another one that's rising above it. Now you have China, which sort of started about 40 years ago or some odd. They started way behind, and now they're rising up, and you could say that, well, that's why they would be sort of taking the helm, or why they would be the sort of world leader for the world's economy, because they're the sort of fastest growing, biggest economy. The outcome is a result of these two systems sort of following their deterministic paths based on the environments that they find themselves, with the natural laws that exist within the confines of those states themselves. The initial conditions and the laws and sort of things drive the system to function the way that it does, and how it ends up is sort of irrelevant. It's just naturally what's going to happen. A good example of this was within 2008, and so you could say that there's a whole bunch of different factors involved there. And the sort of narrative is that banks got greedy, and they basically made a whole bunch of mistakes or took on a whole bunch of risk. And then when there was a crisis, then the banks, a couple of them failed, but most of them were all right. And then they got government bailouts. And those bailouts basically said to the banking system that, well, you can continue to take on risk because we'll bail you out next time. And so that's kind of like the progression of that sort of narrative. That's probably true to a certain extent. I don't know if it's completely true, but there's a whole bunch of nuance into the details, and I don't necessarily know those. But like, just sort of step back and think of like some different motivations or some different systems that were a part of that sort of grander narrative. Like, the first thing is like, people want the best house that they can afford. Like, it's just sort of human nature to want the best that you can get. And so people are driven to get bigger and nicer houses, which means that they're going to go to banks and get more money, and then the money has to come from somewhere. And so internally, though, banks are motivated to maximize their profits, and they have to come up with different solutions to maximizing their profits, or like how they can sort of package up the products that they have so that they can make more profit and off of them. And then you have, at the same time, you have like the government, and the government's sort of role is to maintain stability, or at least to keep things normal enough so that they don't collapse. You have like these different motivations as to why people were sort of getting houses that they couldn't afford. But you also have this different system with the banking system, which is why it was allowed to happen. Like, there was internal motivations within the banks to enable people to get these mortgages that they couldn't afford. And then you like move on to the government, and it has its motivation of like stability, keeping things stable, keeping things safe, keeping things calm. And so like, you have like these three systems, and there's probably more systems, and they're all like kind of working towards their own ends, or they're all working towards their best outcomes for themselves or their best motivations. But like, that creates a system, or that creates a larger system of interacting components. But like, the bigger outcome of that system seems like it's all kind of flowing together, working together, but it is, if you frame it together in a narrative that way. But at the same time, it's like, if you step back, then you have these like sort of interlocking systems, these interlocking narratives or motivations that are kind of leading to this outcome. And of course, I am not saying that conspiracies aren't true, because I know that there are tons and tons of conspiracies that are true. You know, they're happening all of the time, and then we get told that they're not real, but they really are real, and they always are happening. But often, like, it just comes down to like people's personal motivations, sort of the groups that they belong to, and the group's motivations as a whole. And then that is kind of sort of represents like a system. But then there's other systems with similar things, with different individuals with different roles and goals, with sort of working together on purpose or not with other people with similar goals and motivations as them. And that creates sort of an outcome, like a grander outcome. But then there's also these grander outcomes that are happening in other systems with other people. And then at the end, they kind of all come together, and they kind of create this like sort of grand system, or this grand narrative that can be used to describe the situation, which the description can be totally accurate, but like the way that the description sounds might make it seem like there's motivation, that there's control, that there's sort of factors pushing it. But like, the reality is, it's just the sort of deterministic outcome of a sort of a deterministic system. It's like, when you're looking at something from the outside, like, you might not know all of the details, and so it's easier to see sort of the grand strokes and see how they're all connected together. And that might create this idea that there is this like sort of coordinated effort, but the reality is, it's just independent actors sort of working towards their own goals, which happen to coincide with other people having similar goals. A lot of times, like, it's not even like a conspiracy. Like, it's in plain sight, obviously true that, you know, certain people's motivations are driving certain actions. That's just, you know, how it happens. But like, it's kind of like stepping back and sort of thinking about, well, this is part of a system. Like, this is a system that exists. This is like an environment. This is a whole bunch of factors contributing to an outcome, which is sort of like the function of the inputs, which is a function of the environment or the sort of situation where this coincidence of events is happening. Oftentimes, like, systems just sort of trace back to financial motivations, right? To profits. Like, so often the simplest explanation is profit. Someone has money to gain, someone has power to gain by pushing things or behaving in this way, and that's why they're doing it. And that's probably the most easiest, most likely explanation for most situations that we find ourselves in. While things often can be described as grand narratives, they're often more sort of deterministic systems that are beyond any individual's control. And often the people who are involved don't even realize that they're a part of a system. They just see sort of themselves making sort of rational choices, or at least the best choices that they can make given the circumstances, and they all kind of follow a path. And if you kind of take what I'm saying seriously, then you kind of almost come into this place where, like, well, is everything determined? Is like everything a deterministic system? And it seems sometimes that that's the case. Like, I think that we do have choice. I think that we have free will, but I also think that, like, on the grand scale of things, there's a lot of deterministic nature to it. Like, I feel like a lot of it is out of our control, and there's like not much that we can do, even if we make some slightly different choices. I feel like some outcomes are just sort of destined to happen. They're just kind of determined to happen, regardless of the choices that we make at any time. And so let me know what you think about this sort of theory about systems. Let me know in the comments below. If you found this entertaining or informative, click that like button. And if you're curious about learning about how to think about things, but you don't want to be told what to think about them, then click that subscribe button, because that's what I'm here for. You've been watching Making Sense with Robbie. Thanks for watching, and we'll talk next time. Goodbye.